Imagine a place so far above the rest of the world that the sun barely sets in summer, where the darkness of winter lasts for months without interruption, where polar bears genuinely outnumber people, and where the law requires you to carry a rifle whenever you step beyond the edge of town. A place sitting closer to the North Pole than to the nearest major city, wedged deep into the Arctic Ocean, between the Norwegian mainland and the frozen expanse of the polar ice cap, where glaciers cover more than half the total land area, and where the temperature can drop so far below zero that exposed skin becomes a medical emergency within minutes. This is Svalbard, an archipelago so remote and so extreme that the very conditions required to survive here have shaped every single aspect of daily life in ways that most people living anywhere else on Earth would find genuinely difficult to fully imagine. And before we go any further into this remarkable story, if places this extraordinary and this unlike anywhere else genuinely fascinate you, go ahead and hit subscribe right now, because today we are walking through exactly how life actually works for the roughly 3,000 people who call this Arctic archipelago home. Turn on notifications as well, because we have many more journeys to remarkable corners of the world still ahead, and you will not want to miss where we travel to next. Svalbard sits in the Arctic Ocean, roughly midway between the northern coast of mainland Norway and the North Pole itself. The archipelago lies at approximately 78 degrees north latitude, a number that means relatively little until you understand what it actually translates to in practical, lived experience. It means that for roughly 4 months every winter, the sun does not rise above the horizon at all, leaving the islands in a state of perpetual polar night, broken only by moonlight, starlight, and the extraordinary natural light show of the aurora borealis dancing overhead. It means that for roughly 4 months every summer the sun does not set, remaining above the horizon around the clock in the famous midnight sun phenomenon that leaves new arrivals profoundly disoriented and residents deeply accustomed to sleeping with blackout curtains, no matter what time the clock reads. It means that the surrounding ocean freezes into pack ice, extending for hundreds of kilometers in winter, that glaciers creep down from the mountains above the island's valleys, that walruses haul themselves onto rocky beaches to rest in enormous blubbery groups, and that polar bears roam freely across essentially the entire land surface of the archipelago, hunting seals and covering extraordinary distances across both ice and land in the course of their daily lives. The main settlement on Svalbard is a town called Longyearbyen, home to somewhere around 2,300 people on any given day, and functioning as the administrative, commercial, and social center for the entire archipelago. It sits tucked into a valley along the shores of a fjord called Adventfjorden, on the largest island in the archipelago, Spitsbergen, which is also sometimes used informally to refer to the entire archipelago, though technically Svalbard is the proper name for the whole island group. Beyond Longyearbyen, a small number of other human settlements dot the archipelago, including a Russian settlement called Barentsburg, home to a few hundred Russian and Ukrainian coal miners and their families, a tiny Norwegian research settlement at Ny-Ålesund that functions primarily as a scientific research station rather than a conventional town, and the largely unmanned but occasionally visited settlement of Pyramiden, a ghostly abandoned Soviet-era mining town that was abruptly vacated in the 1990s and now stands as one of the most haunting and photogenic examples of frozen-in-time industrial abandonment found anywhere on Earth. Understanding daily life in Svalbard requires understanding first exactly why human beings are living here at all, because the archipelago's settlement history is genuinely unlike almost any other inhabited place in the world. Svalbard was not settled by indigenous people gradually adapting to the Arctic environment over thousands of years, the way that Inuit communities elsewhere in the Arctic were. Instead, it was essentially uninhabited when Dutch and English explorers first documented it in the early 17th century, and the settlement that followed happened in waves driven almost entirely by economic extraction, first through whaling, then through the hunting of walruses, polar bears, and Arctic foxes, and finally, most significantly for Longyearbyen's story specifically, through coal mining. An American entrepreneur named John Munro Longyear established the first permanent coal mining operation on the island in the early 1900s, giving the town its name, and Norwegian, Russian, and other national interests eventually joined the coal extraction activity that came to define the archipelago's economy and give it its unusual multinational character. The legal framework governing Svalbard today traces back to a treaty signed in 1920, the Svalbard Treaty, which recognized Norwegian sovereignty over the archipelago while simultaneously granting the citizens of all signatory nations the equal right to engage in commercial activity there. This remarkable arrangement means that citizens of any of the more than 40 countries that have now signed the treaty can, in principle, live and work in Svalbard without requiring a visa or residency permit, making it one of the most unusual immigration zones found in any country on Earth. In practice, this means that Longyearbyen's population has always been genuinely international, drawing workers from across Norway and various other countries to what remains, despite everything, an essentially company town-style community, shaped profoundly by its mining history, even as the town works to diversify its economic base beyond the coal extraction that originally justified its existence. Coal mining, the activity that created Longyearbyen and defined it for most of its history, continues to operate in significantly reduced form today, though its future remains a subject of active political and economic debate. The Store Norske Spitsbergen Coal Company, the Norwegian state-owned company that has long operated coal mining in Svalbard, continues to run one active mine, Mine 7, supplying coal primarily to provide energy for the town's power plant, though the longer-term future of coal operations on the archipelago faces increasing pressure from Norway's broader environmental commitments and changing energy economics. For Longyearbyen specifically, the practical question of what replaces coal as both an economic driver and an energy source for the town itself sits at the center of ongoing conversations about the community's future and the kind of place it wants to become in the coming decades. Tourism has emerged as the most significant replacement candidate for coal mining's economic role, growing dramatically over the past 2 decades as Svalbard's extraordinary Arctic landscape, abundant wildlife, and unique combination of accessibility and genuine remoteness has made it one of the most sought-after destinations among a particular kind of adventurous traveler. The same conditions that make everyday life here so demanding: the extreme cold, the dramatic landscape of fjords and glaciers, the polar night and midnight sun, the very real presence of polar bears wandering the landscape, have become the primary attractions drawing visitors from around the world to experience something genuinely unlike anything available in more temperate, comfortable destinations. Tour operators offering everything from guided snowmobile expeditions across glaciers and sea ice to small ship cruises exploring the fjords, from dog sled adventures across the tundra to guided hikes through landscapes where you can find fossilized plants from warm tropical climates that existed in this region hundreds of millions of years ago, have collectively built a tourism economy that now contributes substantially to Longyearbyen's economic survival. Research and education have also become increasingly significant pillars of the Svalbard economy, driven by the archipelago's extraordinary scientific value as a location for Arctic research, atmospheric monitoring, climate science, biology, geology, and related fields. The University Center in Svalbard, known locally as UNIS, operates the world's northernmost university, offering courses in Arctic biology, geophysics, geology, and technology to students who come from across Norway and internationally specifically to study in an environment where the subject matter of their research literally surrounds them on every side. Research stations operated by Norwegian, German, French, Chinese, and various other national scientific institutions are scattered across the archipelago, contributing both directly and indirectly to the local economy, and giving Longyearbyen's community its particular flavor of mixing coal miners, tour guides, university researchers, government workers, and various other professionals, all living side by side within a genuinely tiny and isolated population. Now, about that rifle requirement, because it is likely what brought many people to this story in the first place, and it is entirely real. Norwegian authorities require that anyone venturing outside the settled areas of Longyearbyen must carry a rifle capable of stopping a polar bear, a regulation that exists because the risk of encountering a polar bear on Svalbard is not theoretical, it is a genuine, routine fact of living in this particular place. The polar bear population on Svalbard is estimated at around 3,000 individuals, meaning there are actually more polar bears on the archipelago than there are permanent human residents, a ratio that makes the requirement feel significantly less dramatic once you genuinely appreciate what it means. Polar bears are the apex predator of the Arctic ecosystem, large, powerful, and entirely accustomed to viewing other large mammals as potential prey. They roam across essentially every part of the archipelago without regard for human settlement boundaries, regularly wandering through the outskirts of Longyearbyen, occasionally approaching the town itself, and presenting a genuine, non-trivial danger to anyone who encounters one outside the relative safety of a vehicle or a sturdy building. The requirement to carry a rifle when leaving town is therefore not some eccentric legal quirk designed to attract curious tourists, but rather a straightforward safety regulation rooted in genuine ongoing risk. Residents of Longyearbyen largely approach it the same way one might approach wearing a seatbelt, as a sensible precaution that takes a moment of preparation but becomes entirely routine through repetition. Most permanent residents own appropriate rifles, know how to use them proficiently, and carry them as naturally as they carry other essential cold weather equipment whenever they head out beyond the town limits. Visitors and tourists who want to explore outside the settlement typically join organized tours in which the guide carries an appropriate weapon and holds responsibility for group safety, a practical arrangement that works well enough for most visitors while ensuring that Arctic exploration happens with appropriate respect for what can be a genuinely dangerous environment. Polar bear encounters outside town do happen, and the local authorities maintain detailed records of incidents and near misses, using information from these encounters to continuously refine safety protocols and visitor management in areas where bears are frequently active. The Norwegian authorities' approach to polar bear safety reflects a broader commitment to coexisting with the bears rather than simply eliminating the perceived threat they represent, given that polar bears are a protected species under Norwegian law and have been since 1973, following a period of significant hunting pressure that reduced the population substantially. Since protection was established, the polar bear population has recovered considerably, which is genuinely good news for the species, but also means that encounters between bears and people have become more frequent over time rather than less so, making ongoing attention to bear safety protocols continuously relevant. Daily life in Longyearbyen follows patterns that would be broadly recognizable to anyone from a small, closely connected community anywhere in the world, while simultaneously carrying details that are entirely specific to living at 78 degrees north in the high Arctic. Residents shop at the town's main supermarket, which is reasonably well stocked by Arctic standards, though considerably more limited in variety than what most mainlanders take for granted, reflecting the realities of supplying such a remote location. They eat at a modest selection of restaurants, meet for coffee at cafes, take their children to school, attend the local swimming pool and sports facilities, gather at the community's lone cinema, and sustain the kind of ongoing social life that develops when a small group of people share an unusual situation and a particular location far from anywhere else. The supermarket in Longyearbyen deserves particular attention because what it stocks and how it is supplied provides a clear window into the broader practical realities of life in an extremely remote Arctic community. Cargo ships bring the bulk of the town's food, building materials, fuel, and general supplies during the months when sea conditions allow, while air freight handles smaller, more urgent, or more perishable needs throughout the year. Longyearbyen Airport, officially named Svalbard Airport Longyear, operates regular flights connecting the town to Tromsø and Oslo on the Norwegian mainland, year-round service that represents the primary lifeline connecting the community to the rest of the world, and without which daily life in its current form would be essentially impossible. Despite this air connection, prices in Longyearbyen for everyday goods tend to run meaningfully higher than equivalent prices in mainland Norwegian cities, reflecting both the costs of transportation and the logistical complexity of supplying a population this small at this distance. One economic peculiarity that Longyearbyen residents appreciate very directly is the absence of value-added tax on purchases, a consequence of Svalbard's special status under the Svalbard Treaty and its exclusion from Norway's standard tax territory. This exemption extends to alcohol and tobacco as well, which are sold without the considerable taxes that apply on the mainland, a detail that means the town's duty-free shop does unusually brisk business when the regular passenger flights arrive from mainland Norway. This tax-exempt status reflects Svalbard's peculiar legal position as Norwegian territory, but not part of the Norwegian tax area, a distinction that creates a number of interesting practical consequences for how the community is funded, governed, and economically structured compared to any equivalent small community on the Norwegian mainland. Housing in Longyearbyen has a character all its own, shaped by the extreme cold and the practical challenges of building on permafrost, the permanently frozen ground that underlies essentially all of Svalbard and presents significant engineering challenges for any structure attempting to sit stably on it. Buildings in Longyearbyen are typically elevated slightly above ground level on pilings driven down into the permafrost, a design that prevents heat from the building above from warming and destabilizing the frozen ground beneath. A critical consideration, because a building that allows the permafrost below it to thaw will gradually sink, tilt, and eventually suffer serious structural damage. This functional engineering requirement gives Longyearbyen's built landscape a somewhat distinctive visual character, with utility lines also elevated above ground level on similar pole systems rather than buried underground as is standard almost everywhere else, since burying infrastructure in permafrost creates its own set of practical complications. Homes in Longyearbyen are well insulated by necessity, built to retain heat in conditions where outdoor temperatures can drop to -30 degrees Celsius or colder during winter, with wind chill pushing the effective temperature significantly lower still. Heating costs are significant, and residents learn quickly to appreciate both the practical and economic importance of proper insulation, carefully sealed windows, and good building envelope performance in ways that someone living in a milder climate might never have cause to think about very deeply. The town's current heating system has historically relied substantially on coal, with the local power plant burning coal to produce both electricity and the district heating that warms most of Longyearbyen's buildings through an underground pipe network, a system that is practical and reliable but faces ongoing pressure to transition toward less carbon-intensive alternatives as Norway's climate commitments become more stringent. The darkness of polar night, lasting from late October through mid-February in Longyearbyen, represents one of the most psychologically significant aspects of life in the high Arctic, and managing it well is something that residents develop genuine strategies and rituals around over time. The complete absence of sunlight for months at a stretch affects mood, sleep patterns, energy levels, and general psychological well-being in ways that research has thoroughly documented, and that anyone who has spent an Arctic winter will describe readily from personal experience. Longyearbyen has developed a community culture that actively works to counter the psychological weight of polar night through social activities, community events, good interior lighting design that maximizes warmth and brightness within homes and public spaces, and a generally robust attitude toward treating the dark period as something to be embraced and celebrated rather than simply endured. The return of the sun in late winter is treated as a genuine community celebration. Solsiden, or Sun Day, marking the first appearance of the sun above the surrounding mountains after the long dark period, is observed as a meaningful local occasion, with residents gathering to witness and photograph the moment together, participating in a communal acknowledgement of how deeply the absence and return of sunlight matters to daily psychological life in this particular place. Children at the local school receive a traditional marzipan sun cake on Sunday, a sweetly literal edible metaphor for the relief and renewal that the returning sunlight represents after months of darkness. Conversely, the midnight sun of summer, when the sun stays above the horizon continuously for roughly 4 months, presents its own distinctive challenges. The unrelenting light makes sleeping difficult without good blackout curtains, disrupts the normal circadian cues that most people rely on to regulate their daily rhythms, and can leave new arrivals feeling disoriented, energized to strange hours, and uncertain about something as basic as whether it is currently appropriate to be awake or asleep. Long-term residents develop genuine expertise at simply ignoring what their eyes are telling them about the time of day and relying instead on clock time and routine to structure their days, a skill that sounds straightforward but takes genuine adaptation to develop when your body keeps insisting that it must be mid-afternoon, despite the clock reading 2 in the morning. The midnight sun also brings an extraordinary explosion of activity to the outdoor landscape, as the continuous daylight during summer months fuels rapid, intense plant growth in the Arctic tundra, brief but spectacularly vivid flowering seasons in the valley floors and hillsides around town, and massive concentrations of seabirds arriving to nest in the cliffs and hillsides before the window of Arctic summer closes again. Tens of thousands of little auks, puffins, kittiwakes, guillemots, and various other seabird species descend on Svalbard's coastal cliffs each summer, creating one of the most impressive bird spectacles found anywhere in the world and drawing wildlife photographers and nature enthusiasts from across the globe who want to experience it firsthand. Wildlife beyond polar bears and seabirds makes daily life in Svalbard visually remarkable in ways that residents never quite become fully indifferent to, even after years of living here. Reindeer, specifically the Svalbard reindeer, a subspecies notably shorter and stockier than mainland reindeer, adapted to the particular conditions of the high Arctic, roam freely across the tundra and frequently wander through the edges of Longyearbyen itself, apparently quite untroubled by proximity to human settlement in a way that their more human-shy mainland relatives are not. Seeing a small group of Svalbard reindeer grazing on whatever sparse vegetation they can find alongside the road leading into town is so routine that residents barely pause to notice, while it reliably stops new arrivals in their tracks the first several times it happens. Walruses, those magnificent and improbably massive pinnipeds with their distinctive ivory tusks and deeply wrinkled skin, haul out on specific beaches around Svalbard in groups that can number in the hundreds, resting between feeding dives in a collective blubbery heap that generates an impressive amount of noise and, at close range, an equally impressive smell. Approaching these haul-out sites requires care and respect for guidelines designed to avoid disturbing the animals, both for the walrus's well-being and because a disturbed walrus is not an animal you want to be close to without considerable open ground between you, but guided tours specifically to witness walrus haul-outs have become one of the more popular wildlife tourism activities on the archipelago, offering an experience genuinely unlike anything available in more accessible destinations. Arctic foxes, small and perfectly adapted, with thick winter fur that turns from dark summer coloring to brilliant white in winter, are seen fairly regularly around Longyearbyen and across the tundra more broadly, hunting lemmings and Arctic birds, or scavenging for whatever opportunity presents itself in the lean Arctic winter months. They have a boldness around human habitation that reflects generations of relatively low threat from the Longyearbyen residents, and they occasionally cause minor mischief around buildings and storage areas at the outskirts of town, generally regarded with tolerant affection by most residents, even when they are being inconvenient. Education in Longyearbyen is provided through a single school serving children from first grade through upper secondary level, a consequence of the community's small size, meaning that all age groups are accommodated within essentially a single combined school system, rather than the separate primary, middle, and secondary institutions that would be found in any community of equivalent population size on the Norwegian mainland. The school curriculum follows Norwegian national standards, conducted in Norwegian, and children living in Longyearbyen receive the same formal educational foundation as Norwegian children anywhere else in the country, supplemented inevitably by the remarkable living classroom that surrounds them every time they step outside. Learning about Arctic ecosystems, climate science, and environmental change is somewhat more vivid and immediate when the subject matter of those lessons is literally visible from the school windows. The international character of Longyearbyen's population means that many families living there are not Norwegian, and children whose first language may be Thai, Russian, Ukrainian, or any number of other languages must integrate into a school system conducted in Norwegian, a linguistic challenge that the school system has developed specific approaches to managing over years of experience with international families. The Thai community in particular has become a genuinely significant and visible part of Longyearbyen's social fabric, with a substantial number of Thai residents, many of whom came to work in the hospitality, cleaning, and food service industries that support the town's tourism economy, forming a community large enough to have its own social network, cultural celebrations, and informal support structures within the broader Longyearbyen population. This Thai community represents just one dimension of Longyearbyen's genuinely international character, which has given the town a cultural diversity somewhat surprising to first-time visitors expecting an isolated Norwegian mining village. The combination of Norway's liberal residency framework under the Svalbard Treaty, the practical labor demands of a growing tourism industry, and the particular culture of a community that has always attracted adventurous individuals willing to trade the comfort of conventional life for the extraordinary experience of living in the high Arctic, has produced a population more demographically varied than its small size might suggest, with residents holding passports from dozens of different countries living side by side and contributing to a community culture that feels both distinctly Norwegian in its administrative and cultural framework, and genuinely cosmopolitan in ways that emerge from the varied backgrounds of the people who have chosen to make their lives here. The Norwegian governance framework for Svalbard places a governor, known in Norwegian as the Sysselmannen, now officially retitled the Sysselmaster, at the top of the local administrative structure, appointed by the Norwegian government to represent national authority in the archipelago, and to manage the considerable range of regulatory and administrative responsibilities that come with governing such an unusual territory. Below the governor's office, Longyearbyen has its own locally elected community council handling municipal affairs, an arrangement that gives residents a meaningful degree of local self-governance over the practical day-to-day running of the town, while national policy decisions about the broader territory remain with the Norwegian government in Oslo. The Svalbard Environmental Protection Act represents one of the most significant pieces of legislation shaping daily life in the archipelago, reflecting Norway's commitment to protecting the extraordinary and sensitive Arctic environment that covers most of Svalbard's land area. Roughly 65% of the total land area of Svalbard is protected within national parks, nature reserves, and other designated protection zones, meaning that the vast majority of the archipelago exists essentially as it would without human presence at all, visited by researchers, guided tour groups, and the occasional expedition, but otherwise left to its own extraordinary ecological processes. Within these protected areas, strict rules govern what visitors and researchers can do, where they can go, and what traces of their presence they can leave, reflecting a genuinely serious commitment to conservation, rather than the more nominal protections that the label of national park sometimes implies in other parts of the world. One particularly evocative manifestation of this environmental commitment is the rule prohibiting the removal of any items from the protected areas of Svalbard, including cultural heritage items from the archipelago's extensive history of human activity. This means that the remains of old whaling stations, hunting cabins, expedition equipment, shipwrecks, and various other historical artifacts scattered across the landscape of Svalbard are legally protected where they stand, cannot be disturbed or removed, and represent a kind of accidental outdoor museum of Arctic history left exactly in place, subject to the ongoing work of time, weather, and the Arctic elements but not to human interference. A hut built by trappers who spent long, dark winters hunting Arctic foxes a century ago sits in the same location, perhaps slightly more weathered, essentially as it was left when they departed, legally protected in its original place and condition, as a piece of cultural heritage that belongs to the landscape itself rather than to any collector or museum. Medical care in Longyearbyen is provided through a hospital staffed by a small team of physicians and other medical professionals capable of handling emergency and routine care, a facility that punches considerably above its weight in capability given the small population it serves and the extreme environment in which it operates. The reality of being so far from major medical centers means that the Longyearbyen Hospital must be prepared for a wider range of situations than an equivalent small-town facility on the mainland might typically face, because the option of quickly transferring a patient to a larger nearby hospital does not exist in quite the same way here. Serious cases that exceed local treatment capabilities require medical evacuation by air, typically to Tromsø, on the Norwegian mainland, and the combination of extreme weather, limited flight availability, and the distances involved means that stabilizing and managing patients until evacuation is possible represents a genuinely significant part of what the local medical team does. One of the most unusual regulations in Svalbard, frequently cited alongside the rifle requirement as emblematic of the archipelago's genuinely different relationship with the normal rules of human society, is the fact that it is effectively not possible to be born or to die in Longyearbyen. This is not quite as paradoxical as it sounds, but is instead a consequence of the community's remote location and limited medical facilities. Pregnant women approaching their due dates are required to travel to the Norwegian mainland to give birth, since the local hospital does not have the facilities or staffing to handle deliveries safely, particularly if complications arise. Similarly, people who are dying are typically transferred to the mainland, and Longyearbyen has no conventional cemetery in active use, for the straightforward physical reason that permafrost prevents bodies from decomposing properly when buried in the frozen ground, a practical consideration that eliminates the possibility of the kind of burial practices that would normally accompany natural death in most human communities. An old cemetery does exist in Longyearbyen from an earlier era of settlement, and it contains the remains of individuals buried there in the early 20th century before this became a formal concern, including the graves of victims of the 1918 influenza pandemic, whose remains have actually become a subject of significant scientific interest, since the permafrost has preserved the bodies in a state that allowed researchers to recover intact viral material from the influenza that killed them, contributing to scientific understanding of that pandemic. But for the contemporary community, the practical consequence of the birth and death regulations is simply that people travel to the mainland for these particular life events, meaning that the official birthplace listed on the documents of anyone born to parents living in Longyearbyen will typically be Tromsø or another Norwegian mainland city, rather than Svalbard itself. The Russian settlement of Barentsburg, roughly 90 kilometers from Longyearbyen by sea, operates as a genuinely separate world within the same archipelago, maintained by Russia under the terms of the Svalbard Treaty's equal access provisions, as what amounts to a piece of Russia transplanted into the high Arctic, complete with a Lenin statue in the central square, Cyrillic signage, a culture house, a coal mining operation of its own, and an atmosphere that visiting travelers frequently describe as stepping back into a specific vision of the Soviet industrial past that has been preserved in the Arctic cold as thoroughly as any biological sample in a permafrost core. The Russian presence on Svalbard has been continuous since the 1920s, and the maintenance of Barentsburg, which requires significant ongoing investment for a relatively small coal operation that is not particularly profitable by modern standards, reflects the strategic importance Russia places on maintaining an active presence in the Svalbard archipelago under the terms that the treaty allows. Relations between the Norwegian and Russian communities on Svalbard are generally cordial in a matter-of-fact way, with the two settlements aware of each other's presence and occasionally interacting, but essentially operating as separate, largely self-contained communities rather than as parts of a single integrated town. Tourists can visit Barentsburg, typically as part of organized boat or snowmobile tours that bring visitors over from Longyearbyen for a day, and the experience of standing in front of the Lenin statue while surrounded by Arctic wilderness represents one of the more specifically surreal experiences that Svalbard can offer to visitors who make the effort to seek it out. Pyramiden, the abandoned Soviet mining settlement that was abruptly vacated in 1998 following the death of a worker that apparently triggered a decision to simply close the operation, represents an even more remarkable encounter with a specific frozen moment in history. Everything was left essentially as it stood when the workers departed. Cultural hall, swimming pool, library, sports facilities, apartments, all of it standing in the Arctic silence, with a quality of abandonment that is somehow both haunting and thoroughly fascinating. Occasional caretakers now maintain a minimal presence to prevent the most dramatic structural deterioration and to allow organized tourist visits, and Pyramiden has become one of the most photographed and written about examples of Soviet-era industrial abandonment anywhere in the world, helped considerably by the fact that the Arctic climate has preserved it in a state of relatively intact decay rather than the more aggressive deterioration that warmer and wetter climates would have produced over the same 25 years. The food culture of Longyearbyen reflects its Norwegian identity, its international population, and the practical realities of supplying an Arctic community. Norwegian culinary traditions, including various preparations of fish, reindeer, and other game meats alongside standard Nordic staples, appear naturally in home cooking and in restaurants that draw specifically on local and Arctic ingredients. Reindeer meat, from the Svalbard reindeer that are managed through a sustainable hunting program, features on restaurant menus and in local homes as a genuinely local, specifically Arctic food source that connects eating habits directly to the landscape. Fresh, locally caught Arctic char, a fish found in Svalbard's freshwater streams and lakes, similarly appears in both home cooking and restaurant offerings as one of the more literally locally sourced ingredients available in this otherwise heavily import-dependent community. The restaurant scene in Longyearbyen has developed beyond what the population size alone would suggest, driven by tourism and by the fact that the town functions as a hub for expeditions, research missions, and various other activities that bring visitors with varying levels of appetite for quality dining experiences even in the far north. A handful of restaurants offering well-executed Norwegian and international cuisine operate successfully within the town, serving both residents for whom eating out represents a genuine evening social activity, and visitors who arrive expecting that remoteness and quality food are not necessarily incompatible. The local grocery store supplies the building blocks for home cooking and is considerably better stocked than many first-time visitors anticipate, though the price point for essentially everything reflects the transportation costs involved in getting it there. The social life of Longyearbyen revolves around a set of institutions and gathering places that reflect both the small community's practical needs and its specific Arctic character. The local pub and social venues serve the essential function of providing neutral gathering places where the varied members of a small, international, isolated community can mix across professional, national, and social lines, a function that takes on particular importance in a place where the extreme environment and intense winter darkness can otherwise push people toward isolation if the social infrastructure does not actively work against it. Community events, cultural activities, and organized social occasions are taken seriously as genuine contributions to collective well-being, rather than simply optional entertainment, reflecting a broadly understood awareness that maintaining a functional, positive community social fabric matters considerably more in the extreme conditions of an Arctic winter than it might in a less demanding environment. Sports and outdoor recreation represent central pillars of how Longyearbyen residents manage both physical fitness and psychological health through the long, dark winters and the extraordinary summer months alike. Dog sledding holds an especially prominent place in the local recreational culture, with dog sled teams operated both by commercial tour operators offering guided excursions to visitors and by private residents who maintain their own teams for personal recreation and participation in local racing events. The annual Svalbard dog sled race draws participants and spectators and serves as one of the major community sporting events on the local calendar, combining genuine athletic competition with a mode of Arctic transport that connects directly to the historical, practical realities of moving across the terrain before snowmobiles made it a recreational choice rather than a practical necessity. Snowmobiles, called snow scooter in Norwegian, are the dominant mode of winter transportation for getting around outside the town itself and across the broader landscape of Svalbard when conditions allow. Owning and operating a snowmobile is essentially standard for residents who regularly need to travel beyond the town limits, whether for work, recreation, or accessing the wilderness experiences that represent one of the primary reasons many people choose to live here in the first place. Snowmobile expeditions across the sea ice, up glaciers, through mountain passes, and across the open tundra are a regular feature of winter life for engaged residents, offering access to landscapes of genuinely extraordinary beauty and silence that can only be reached in winter by this particular means. Summer outdoor recreation shifts naturally toward hiking, boat trips exploring the fjords, kayaking, cycling on the limited road network, and the pursuit of the extraordinary wildlife viewing opportunities that the midnight sun's continuous daylight makes available throughout the 24-hour cycle. The glaciers of Svalbard represent some of the most visually dramatic features of the landscape and some of the most scientifically significant indicators of ongoing climate change in the entire Arctic region. Covering approximately 60% of the total land area of the archipelago, these glaciers range from small valley glaciers tucked into mountain hollows to enormous tidewater glaciers several kilometers wide that flow directly into the fjords and periodically calve spectacular chunks of ice into the water in events dramatic enough to generate small tsunamis in the immediate vicinity. Witnessing glacier calving from the appropriate safe viewing distance, watching a wall of ancient ice suddenly fracture and collapse into the fjord water in a thunderous cascade of white and blue, is one of the most viscerally impressive natural spectacles that Svalbard's landscape regularly offers, and it draws visitors specifically seeking that experience year after year. The same glaciers that create such spectacular scenery are also retreating measurably year by year, a direct and visible consequence of the rapid warming that the Arctic is experiencing at a rate roughly 4 times faster than the global average, making Svalbard one of the most dramatically demonstrative locations on Earth for observing the physical effects of climate change in real time. Researchers at UNIS and at various international research stations across the archipelago study this change intensively, producing data that contributes to global understanding of how Arctic climate is shifting and what those shifts mean for everything from sea level rise to global weather patterns. For residents and long-term visitors, the change is visible not just in measurements and research papers, but in the direct, year-by-year comparison of photographs showing specific glaciers 50 years ago versus today, a comparison that makes the scale of change impossible to dismiss as abstract or distant. The permafrost that underlies essentially all of Svalbard's land surface is itself responding to warming temperatures in ways that have begun to create very practical challenges for the built environment of Longyearbyen. As the upper layers of permafrost warm and begin to destabilize, the ground on which buildings sit becomes less reliably solid, creating risks of subsidence, structural damage, and the need for costly engineering interventions to stabilize affected buildings. Slope stability is affected as well, with thawing permafrost increasing the risk of rock slides and landslides on the steep valley sides above and around Longyearbyen, a risk that has already caused serious harm and prompted significant relocation of some residential areas to safer ground. These are not abstract future concerns, but ongoing, actively managed challenges that shape town planning decisions, housing policy, and infrastructure investment in Longyearbyen right now, making climate change not just an environmental principle, but a daily practical reality in the running of the community. The Global Seed Vault, perhaps the most practically significant and philosophically resonant structure in all of Svalbard, sits carved into a mountain above Longyearbyen, an international facility storing the seeds of an extraordinary range of the world's agricultural plant varieties in the stable, naturally cold conditions provided by the surrounding permafrost. The vault serves as a global insurance policy against the loss of agricultural biodiversity through disasters, conflicts, disease, or any other catastrophe that might destroy existing seed collections around the world. Preserving the genetic options needed to rebuild food systems from a physical location, chosen specifically because its remoteness, political stability under Norwegian administration, and natural cold provide optimal long-term preservation conditions. The irony that even this vault designed to survive virtually any disaster has had to deal with some water ingress linked to warming temperatures destabilizing the surrounding permafrost is not lost on climate scientists monitoring the facility. Community identity in Longyearbyen carries a particular character, shaped by the fact that almost everyone who lives here has made a conscious, deliberate choice to do so, typically accepting both significant financial and logistical complications in exchange for the specific experience of living in one of the most extreme, dramatic, and genuinely unusual inhabited places on Earth. This creates a community with a reasonably high baseline of resilience, adaptability, and openness to the unconventional, since people willing to move to an Arctic archipelago at 78 degrees north are self-selected for a particular kind of adventurousness and tolerance for discomfort that screens out those who would find the conditions simply too demanding. The result is a social atmosphere that many residents describe as unusually open, unpretentious, and genuinely welcoming of newcomers. Since almost everyone is relatively new in the context of a community with essentially no multi-generational settler families of the kind that defines social hierarchy in many other small towns. This is not to say that Longyearbyen is without its social tensions or community challenges. The high turnover of population, with many residents staying for a few years before moving on to opportunities elsewhere, creates a community where sustained long-term investment in social and civic institutions can be difficult to maintain when so much of the population is always in the process of arriving or departing. Housing is limited and expensive, reflecting both the costs of construction in permafrost and the competitive market created by a steady demand from new arrivals in a community with a strictly limited building footprint. The concentration of economic activity around a small number of industries means that shifts in any one of them, such as the ongoing uncertainty around coal mining's future, create community-wide economic anxiety rather than being absorbed through the kind of diverse economic base that a larger community would have. Children growing up in Longyearbyen have an upbringing that is by any measure genuinely unusual, shaped from the earliest age by the rhythms of polar night and midnight sun, by the genuine, not hypothetical presence of polar bears as a fact of the landscape, by the international character of the community surrounding them, by the extraordinary natural environment visible from every window and accessible on every outdoor adventure, and by the quiet knowledge that their hometown is simultaneously one of the most remote and one of the most remarkable places in the entire world. Former residents who grew up in Longyearbyen and later moved to the mainland frequently describe a persistent sense that nowhere else quite measures up to the raw, uncompromising natural drama of the place where they grew up, and many eventually find themselves drawn back, unable to fully trade the Arctic sky for anything more temperate and predictable. Local culture in Longyearbyen has developed its own particular flavor and traditions over the decades, distinct from the wider Norwegian cultural context it is nominally part of. The annual Polar Jazz Festival, held each January in the depths of polar night, brings internationally recognized jazz musicians to Longyearbyen for a multi-day festival that has developed a significant reputation well beyond the local community, drawing visitors specifically for the music in a setting that combines concert performances with the extraordinary experience of Polar Night Svalbard. The Dark Season Blues Festival is another highlight of the winter cultural calendar, providing both genuine musical quality and the practical community service of injecting energy and social activity into the period when the absence of sunlight most tests everyone's reserves. These and other